You know how the only denim you can ever find from the thrift store are men's jeans from the 2000s and 90s? And you know how you bought them thinking you could alter them even though they're way too big for you and your sewing darts cannot finesse around those big pockets? And you know how they're now sitting in the back of your closet doing nothing? Well, now they're gonna see the light of day and protect you from it too. Today I'm sewing a reversible bucket hat. I've already made a bucket hat before, but I've learned a lot of things from this process, which is what I want to share with you, and hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. Unlike the original hat that I made, the hat I'll be making today will not have any patchwork and will have a really straight brim. The first thing you're going to need, of course, is a pair of old jeans. I thrifted mine specifically for this project and made sure that they were 100% cotton and a little bit on the thicker side, so that the brim of the hat would be really straight like the popular bucket hat cut right now. Since I wasn't planning on wearing these jeans, I bought them as oversized as possible so I could have more material to work with. The original pair of jeans I made the old bucket hat out of is actually a pair that I've been deconstructing slowly for the past couple of months for various projects and now look like a pair of Coachella bottoms. I also thrifted the second pair that I used for the second side of the bucket hat to make a visual distinction between both sides. And I'm going to be using this in future DIYs, so I thought why not add to my already growing collection of good fabric. Low-key, I was kind of into this pair even though I usually go for a more monochromatic wash, but I knew they'd be better purpose as the bucket hat, and they were way too Y2K for my current wardrobe, so I'd have nothing to pair them with. I see some Y2K trends and I'm on board, but some of them I do not understand at all why people are into wearing them. But watch me be buying those lacy tank tops in 2 weeks when the mirror exposure effect finally gets to my head. If you do want to have one side of the hat be different than the other or have patchwork, then you can also turn the fabric inside out instead of buying a pair of separate jeans. This is actually a really good way to use the jeans that you don't like the wash of, because typically the inside of jeans have a really nice consistent light wash. The second step to making your bucket hat is making the pattern. Now, we do not have to study harder. We have to study smarter. In this case, that means working with resources we already have. So I went on this blog, The Essentials Club, which is linked down below, and then I printed out their pattern. But I had to test out if the pattern would fit me, which it didn't, unfortunately. And then I had to do more patchwork, and then I kind of ruined the original bucket hat I made. It was too small, then it was too big, and then it was just kind of like awkward in the back with all the new alterations. But I've learned, and now I'm going to tell you how I fixed my mistakes. And the reason I'm not using a pattern that's already out there, which would be the most convenient thing, is I couldn't find a pattern that was just right for the size that I was going for and the style. So here's how I adjusted the fit and style preference of the pattern that already existed. I measured the circumference of my head and used my good old geometry skills. You know, cherry pie delicious, then salt for delicious, to make sure that your cherry pie is the same length all around. I use a circle that I printed out as a reference to what a good and even sized circle looked like, and luckily the circle I printed out was pretty close to what I needed anyway, which was really helpful. But you can obviously use a container, a plate, half a watermelon, anything you have works. I used a brown paper roll to make the pattern, but you can also use a brown paper bag or any scrap paper you have lying around. I added half an inch of seam allowance on all sides of the circle, which ends up being 1 inch extra on the diameter, or on the delicious. When I was drawing the headband part of the pattern, I first drew it with a pencil, but I knew that the measurements of the pattern that I printed out were too small, so I extended it horizontally. This way I didn't have to figure out the angle of the arch or anything like that. I could stick to the geometry reservoir of knowledge I already had, and this was me just trying to make it easier. Studying hard and not smarter. Before you create the pattern for your headband, make sure that the bottom curve of the headband is a little bit more than half the circumference of the circle. And add seam allowance, of course. If you have a longer forehead or you want the hat to lie lower on your head so it's a little more functional and can actually block you from the sun, then I would make the brim longer, but mine ended up being 3 inches without the seam allowance. The pattern I used was designed for 4 pieces of fabric instead of 2, so what I did was I mirrored the 1 piece that they printed, but I used 2 instead for this hat to make the assembly easier. I mirrored the printed out shape to get the extended one I wanted. I do, however, like the patch design more actually, but that's slightly more challenging if you aren't ready for that yet. You gotta measure everything perfectly, which is where my first hat went wrong, honestly. So for the brim of the hat, I wanted to keep it like a medium length, not too short, because I still want to protect myself from the sun and be able to dart my eyes away from strangers in public. My brim is about 2 inches long without the seam allowance. Because I was making my hat reversible and not have a raw hem this time, I added seam allowance on the top and the bottom of the brim. Once again, I used the printed out pattern as a guide and extended it horizontally to match the length of the bigger arch of the headband, where the 2 pieces meet up. Before I cut my fabric, I made sure that all my pattern pieces were symmetrical by folding them in half and then trimming the excess. I also pinned the paper together into the shape of the hat to make sure that everything was looking good and everything was like measured correctly still. Finally, I pinned the pattern to the fabric and then I cut out 1 circle, 2 brims, and 2 headbands. I folded all of the cutouts in half to trim the edges and make them all symmetrical like I did with the pattern paper. If you're confident that your hat is already perfect, then go ahead and cut out a second copy of this material for the second part of the hat. But I wanted to make sure that my hat was a perfect fit, so I waited until I could actually confirm that my hat was perfect before making the second one. You can still reference your paper pattern to cut out your new material later. So no loss there. Then, just like the paper, I pinned the right side of the jeans cutouts together into the hat shape. The smaller part of the headband attaches to the circle, and the smaller part of the brim attaches to the bigger part of the headband. To make sure that the 4 folds in my hat were all symmetrical and aligned properly, I folded my circle in half, then that created a crease on it to mark where I need to pin my extra fabric. And I didn't pin the seam allowance to the circle because that isn't going to be sewn into the circle. I pinned the seam allowances together vertically. So once you have it all pinned, you have 2 options. You can go into the sewing machine straight and just do it all like that, or you can take a slightly safer route, which is better if you're a beginner, and hand sew the hat together roughly. You don't have to do it like perfectly, just like every like centimeter or so you need to stitch. If you aren't that experienced or are a perfectionist, then I suggest going with the latter option. I suggest sewing it by hand to make sure that the hat fits perfectly before locking it all in place with the sewing machine. If you're going to sew it directly into the sewing machine, you can also remove the brim pins and then sew first the headband to the circle and then attach the brim later, but I was really lazy and I was like, I think I can do this, so I just left the pins in and did it that way. I felt like the risk was worth it. By the way, this whole project can be done by hand if you don't have a sewing machine. I've done projects like this by hand and it's not that bad. You just have to be like rewatching a show or listening to a podcast at the same time, and it makes the time go a lot faster. So I sewed the entire hat together and almost everything was perfect. You could stop here and add a hem to the front, but I wanted to make this hat reversible, so I had to sew a whole nother hat. So I needed to cut out the second pattern and sew it all together, which is actually the easy part once you've figured out how to make the pattern. I realized I needed a slightly larger seam on the circle, but I also couldn't make it too much bigger because the hats needed to be pretty identical because they were going to become one hat later on. If you really did mess up the circle size like I did in my first hat, it's really not a big deal because you can just add arches that fit the circle as patches, or you can go back and rip the seams out. Like, it's really not a big deal. It's part of sewing life. Everyone goes through it. When you've made your second bucket hat and inevitably have a pair of leftover jeans with weird cutouts in them, you know you're ready for the final steps. Turn both of the bucket hats inside out and pin the end of the brim together almost the whole way around. Make sure to leave a small opening to turn the hat inside out. After I pinned the hat, I turned it inside out just to make sure that everything looked good. Then I turned the hat back to where I could see the pins and all the raw hems on the outside. So here what I did was I zigzag stitched all the raw hems to make sure that they weren't going to fray anymore. Then I also sewed a straight stitch on the 2 meeting points of the hat at the end of the brim. This part was surprisingly very easy. Using the tiny opening I had left on the hat, I then turned the hat so that all the closed seams were on the outside. We are so close to being done now, but these final touches are crucial to how the hat will turn out at the end and how professional it could potentially look. First, I ironed the meeting point of the 2 different fabrics at the brim together, including the part I didn't sew, and then I folded a hem there. I went over the hem with a straight stitch and made it really flat. You can also add decorative stitching around the hat, which will actually help it stick together as one piece better, but I wasn't willing to risk not being able to sew a straight stitch, or at least like 5 straight lines in a row.
Yeah. She a little bad, hit her with the bag, yeah. Put it on the tab, don't know how to act, yeah. How you like that? How you like that?
The final hat hat turned out so good. Like, even I was surprised by how well I was able to execute this. I really have to emphasize that making the pattern is the most important part. The sewing part is actually not that hard for this. It's all about just like making all the pieces correctly, making sure they're all even and have the same length all around. I can actually turn the brim of the hat up if I want to, or keep it down when I gotta block out those haters, but not my teachers on Zoom, unfortunately. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and I know this isn't like a super original idea or anything, but I couldn't find a pattern that was perfect for the style and the size that I was looking for, and I didn't want to teach you guys how to make it from scratch. I wanted to work with a pattern that already existed because that makes the process just a whole lot faster, which is why I put my own twist on this project. Thank you so much for watching. That's all for now. Bye.